Over the past several days, you've probably started seeing headlines about Democrats calling for Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem to resign. Some pushing for impeachment and others threatening to block funding for her department. And if you're just scrolling through your phone, it probably looks like another one of those Washington pile-ons that comes and goes every few weeks. Another controversy, another politician under fire, another story that feels easy to ignore. But this one didn't start in Congress, and it didn't start on social media. In fact, it started when 2 people were shot and killed by federal agents in Minneapolis, and with a series of official explanations that don't cleanly match what people can see for themselves on video. That's why this hasn't gone away. You see, earlier this month in Minneapolis, Alex Pretti, a U.S. citizen, was shot and killed during a federal enforcement operation. Soon after, Secretary Noem said that Pretti had approached agents with a handgun and violently resisted when they tried to disarm him. And that framing made it sound like a clear-cut case of self-defense. But then cell phone footage and eyewitness videos began circulating online, and in those final moments before he was killed, they don't clearly show him threatening officers in the way the official statement suggested. Local officials also confirmed that Pretti had a legal permit to carry a firearm, which made people start asking whether this situation was as straightforward as it was initially presented. Not long before this one, another incident started the fire. Renee was shot and killed in her car by a federal officer, and Secretary Noem described the shooting in extremely strong terms, calling it an act of domestic terrorism and saying Good had tried to harm agents. And once again, videos and witness accounts appeared that raised serious doubts about that version of events. So now you have 2 separate shootings, 2 very confident official explanations, and 2 sets of publicly available evidence that don't fully support those explanations. At that point, this stopped being just about tragic encounters and dangerous situations and started becoming a leadership issue. Members of Congress began demanding answers. More than 100 Democrats signed onto an impeachment resolution. Several senators publicly called for Noem to step down. Others said they would refuse to support the Department of Homeland Security funding unless there was meaningful accountability here. That kind of response doesn't happen over nothing. DHS responded by standing firmly behind its officers and emphasizing that they are enforcing laws passed by Congress, while also warning that political attacks could make an already dangerous job even more difficult. And to be fair, immigration enforcement is dangerous work. We see it. Agents regularly find themselves in very tense, unpredictable situations, and sometimes things escalate faster than anyone would like. That's real. That's real life here. But what has made this situation worse is not just that shootings happened, it's how quickly and confidently the department presented explanations that later become questionable. In both cases, leadership locked in a narrative almost immediately, framing the incidents as justified before all of the evidence was publicly available. Then, when videos appeared, that complicated that narrative, and there was no clear correction, no clear acknowledgement that the situation might be more complex than first described. And once you take that approach, it becomes very difficult to change course because backing off starts to look like admitting fault. And on top of that, DHS investigates its own use of force incidents, controls what evidence is reviewed, and decides what gets released and when, which means that even when those reviews are conducted properly, many people simply aren't convinced by the results. That's why lawmakers are now using impeachment talk and funding threats as leverage. It's not because they enjoy creating standoffs, and it's not because they want a government shutdown. It's because internal reviews aren't satisfying anyone in these cases. Republicans are describing the backlash as political theater and an attack on law enforcement, and for some voters, that argument might work. But it doesn't answer the basic problem. When official statements and video evidence don't line up, somebody has to explain why, and so far, that hasn't really happened in any kind of convincing way. And here's what happens if that doesn't change. If leadership learns that disputed shootings can be handled by issuing strong early statements, limiting outside scrutiny, and relying on internal reviews, then that becomes the default response for all future incidents. You get fast justifications, slow disclosures, and very few consequences. Not necessarily because individual officers want that, but because that's the environment leadership creates. And that's the pattern lawmakers are trying to interrupt right now. This is why Kristi Noem is facing so much pressure. Not simply because 2 people were killed on her watch, since tragic outcomes can happen in any dangerous job, but because her department's response made the situation more controversial instead of less, by overstating certainty early on, by sticking to claims that later looked shaky at best, by not immediately opening the process to independent review. So going forward, the situation is actually pretty simple. If DHS agrees to independent investigators with full access to evidence, releases complete and unedited footage, and allows Congress to see exactly how these decisions were made, this story will probably calm down. But if it doesn't, it's just going to keep growing, because every future incident will now be viewed through this same lens. My read here is pretty straightforward. Kristi Noem's political future depends on whether she changes how these cases are handled. If she continues defending first and explaining later, she likely won't survive this. If she opens the process and accepts outside scrutiny, maybe she does. Either way, this is no longer about partisan outrage. It's about whether the department is willing to back up its claims with full transparency instead of just asking the public to take its word for it. And until that happens, this story, not going anywhere. I'm Hank, here to explain the chaos, not hype it. If you want clarity instead of noise, you're in the right place.